Picture this. You're standing at the altar, surrounded by everything you've dreamed of for months, maybe even years. The flowers are perfect, your dress fits like it was made by angels, and the love of your life is standing right there, ready to promise forever. Then suddenly, instead of hearing, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the priest's voice cuts through the air with two words that will change everything: Code Black. This is the story of Sarah Martinez, whose fairy tale wedding became something no bride could ever prepare for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been planning this day since she was 7 years old. Growing up in a small town outside Denver, Colorado, she'd spend hours sketching wedding dresses in the margins of her school notebooks, dreaming of the perfect ceremony. When she met David Thompson during her senior year at Colorado State University, she knew she'd found her person. David was studying to become a paramedic, drawn to helping others in their most vulnerable moments, while Sarah was pursuing her degree in elementary education, wanting to shape young minds and hearts. Their love story was the kind that made their friends believe in soulmates again. David would surprise Sarah with handwritten notes tucked into her textbooks, and Sarah would pack extra sandwiches in her lunch just so David wouldn't go hungry during his long study sessions at the library. After graduation, David proposed during a quiet moment at their favorite hiking spot overlooking the Rocky Mountains, presenting a ring he'd saved for 8 months to buy. The wedding planning process was a labor of love that consumed nearly 18 months of their lives. Sarah's mother, Maria, had always dreamed of giving her daughter the wedding she never had, and David's parents, both retired teachers, were equally invested in making the day perfect. They chose St. Michael's Catholic Church, the same place where Sarah had been baptized and confirmed, where her grandmother had been married 60 years earlier. Every detail was meticulously planned. The flowers were white roses and baby's breath, arranged by Sarah's aunt, who owned a local florist shop. The reception was set to take place at the historic Riverside Ballroom, complete with a 7-piece band that specialized in both traditional wedding music and the contemporary songs that had marked important moments in Sarah and David's relationship. Sarah's dress, a stunning ivory creation with delicate lace sleeves and a cathedral-length train, had been her grandmother's, carefully altered to fit Sarah's petite frame. The guest list included 143 people, family members who had traveled from as far as Texas and California, college friends who had maintained their bond despite scattered careers in new cities, childhood friends who had watched Sarah and David's relationship blossom, and colleagues from both of their workplaces who had become like extended family. Father Miguel Rodriguez, who had been serving St. Michael's for over 20 years, was to officiate the ceremony. He had known Sarah since she was a child in Sunday school, had watched her grow from a shy girl who hid behind her mother's skirt to a confident woman ready to start her own family. Father Rodriguez had spent considerable time with Sarah and David during their pre-marriage counseling sessions, discussing everything from communication strategies to financial planning to their shared faith. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn sunshine that makes Colorado famous. Sarah woke up at 6 in the morning in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by her bridesmaids, her sister Elena, her best friend from college, Jessica, her cousin Monica, and David's sister Rebecca. The atmosphere was electric with excitement and nervous energy as they began the elaborate process of getting ready. Hair and makeup started at 7 with a professional team that Sarah had researched for months. While hot rollers worked their magic and foundation was carefully applied, the women shared stories, laughed until their sides hurt, and took dozens of photos to capture every moment. Sarah's mother fluttered around the room, making sure everyone had eaten breakfast, that the flowers had arrived on schedule, and that all the various vendors knew exactly where to be and when. By noon, the bridal party was dressed and ready. Sarah stood before the full-length mirror in her childhood bedroom, looking at herself in her grandmother's dress, her hair swept into an elegant updo adorned with pearl pins that had belonged to her great-grandmother. The transformation was complete, and she looked every inch the bride she had always imagined herself becoming. Meanwhile, at David's parents' house across town, the groomsmen were going through their own preparation ritual. David, normally calm under pressure thanks to his emergency medical training, found himself uncharacteristically nervous. adjusting his tie for the dozenth time and checking his pocket to make sure the vows he had handwritten were still safely tucked away. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with guests arriving starting at 2:30. St. Michael's Church looked absolutely magnificent, transformed by the careful work of Sarah's family and the church's volunteer decorating committee. White ribbon adorned each pew, and arrangements of white roses and greenery marked the aisle that Sarah would soon walk down toward her future. As guests began to arrive, the atmosphere was filled with that special energy that surrounds weddings, a mixture of joy, anticipation, and celebration that seems to make everything more vivid and meaningful. David's paramedic colleagues arrived in a group, still discussing the busy shift they had just finished. Sarah's former students and their parents filled several pews, excited to see their beloved teacher get married. Extended family members who hadn't seen each other in years used the time before the ceremony to catch up, sharing photos and stories while they waited for the processional to begin. At 2:45, David and his groomsmen took their positions at the front of the church. David looked handsome in his black tuxedo, his usually unruly hair perfectly styled for the occasion. His best man, Marcus, who had been his partner on the ambulance crew for 3 years, stood beside him, occasionally offering quiet words of encouragement and checking to make sure David had everything he needed. Father Rodriguez appeared from the sacristy wearing his finest ceremonial vestments. He had officiated hundreds of weddings over his 2 decades at St. Michael's, but he always felt a special warmth for ceremonies involving young people he had watched grow up in the church. He took his position at the altar, reviewed his notes one final time, and smiled at David with the kind of paternal affection that had made him beloved by generations of parishioners. The church organist, Mrs. Patterson, who had been playing for weddings at St. Michael's for 35 years, began the prelude music. The familiar strains of classical pieces filled the sanctuary, setting the perfect tone for the sacred ceremony about to begin. Guests settled into their seats, programs in hand, cameras ready to capture every precious moment. At exactly 3 o'clock, the processional began. The first bridesmaid, Rebecca, began her slow walk down the aisle, followed by Monica, then Jessica, and finally Elena, Sarah's maid of honor. Each woman looked radiant in her deep burgundy dress, carrying a simple bouquet of white roses tied with ivory ribbon. The guests turned in their seats to watch, smiling at the beauty of the moment and the obvious joy on each face. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The organist transitioned into the traditional wedding march, and every person in the church rose to their feet. Sarah appeared at the back of the church, arm in arm with her father, Roberto, who had been looking forward to this moment for months while simultaneously dreading having to give his little girl away. Sarah looked absolutely breathtaking as she began her walk down the aisle. Her grandmother's dress fit her perfectly, the intricate lacework catching the light from the stained glass windows. Her veil flowed behind her like something from a fairy tale, and her smile on her face was pure joy. She looked directly at David, who was fighting back tears as he watched the woman he loved approach. The guests were silent except for the occasional whispered, "She looks beautiful," or the soft click of camera shutters capturing the moment. Sarah's mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while David's mother reached for his father's hand, both of them overcome with emotion at seeing these 2 young people they had watched fall in love finally reaching this milestone. As Sarah and her father reached the front of the church, Roberto lifted his daughter's veil and kissed her cheek, whispering something in her ear that made her smile even brighter. He then shook David's hand firmly, the gesture carrying all the weight of a father entrusting his daughter's happiness to another man. Sarah took David's offered arm, and together they turned to face Father Rodriguez. The priest opened his ceremonial book and looked out at the gathered congregation with a warm smile. "Dearly beloved," he began in his rich, resonant voice that had comforted and celebrated with this community for so many years. We are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join Sarah Elena Martinez and David Michael Thompson in holy matrimony. The familiar words of the wedding ceremony began, each phrase carrying the weight of tradition and the promise of the future. Father Rodriguez spoke about love, commitment, and the sacred bond that marriage represents. Sarah and David listened intently, holding hands and occasionally exchanging glances that spoke of their deep connection and shared excitement about the journey they were beginning together. The ceremony continued beautifully, following the traditional Catholic wedding liturgy that had united countless couples before Sarah and David. Father Rodriguez spoke eloquently about the sanctity of marriage, the importance of mutual respect and understanding, and the role that faith would play in their life together. His words were both deeply spiritual and remarkably practical, touching on the daily realities of building a life with another person, while maintaining the sense of sacred commitment that had brought everyone to the church that day. Sarah and David had chosen to include several personal touches in their ceremony. Sarah's cousin Maria performed a solo of Ave Maria, her clear soprano voice filling the church and bringing tears to many eyes. David's younger brother read from Corinthians about love being patient and kind, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness at speaking in front of such a large group. The exchange of rings was particularly moving. David had chosen a simple white gold band for Sarah with a small inscription inside that read, "Forever and always," the phrase he had written in every anniversary card since they had started dating. Sarah's ring for David was equally simple and elegant, inscribed with "My heart, my home," words she had whispered to him the night he proposed. As Father Rodriguez blessed the rings and spoke about their symbolism as ending circles representing eternal love, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace and rightness. This was exactly how she had always imagined her wedding would feel, surrounded by everyone she loved, committed to the man who had become her best friend and her greatest love, in the church where she had learned about faith and community. The congregation was fully engaged in the ceremony, responding at appropriate moments, sharing in the prayers, and witnessing this sacred commitment with obvious joy. Sarah's grandmother, now 87 and using a walker, had insisted on being present despite her recent health challenges, and she sat in the front row beaming with pride and remembering her own wedding day in this same sanctuary decades earlier. David's paramedic training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but standing at the altar, he found his emotions much closer to the surface than usual. As he looked at Sarah, radiant in her wedding dress and glowing with happiness, he felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the path that had led them to this moment. He thought about all the late-night study sessions they had shared in college, the way Sarah had supported him through his challenging paramedic training, and how she had never wavered in her belief in their relationship, even during the difficult periods when his work schedule made it hard to spend time together. The ceremony was approaching its climax, the moment that everyone had come to witness. Father Rodriguez had guided Sarah and David through their personal vows, which they had written themselves after weeks of drafting and revising, wanting to capture exactly what their love meant to them. Sarah had promised to support David's calling to serve others, even when it meant late nights and dangerous situations. David had promised to nurture Sarah's dreams of teaching and creating a classroom where every child felt valued and encouraged. Now, Father Rodriguez was preparing to speak the words that would officially unite them as husband and wife. The church was completely silent, except for the soft rustle of fabric as guests leaned forward slightly, not wanting to miss this pivotal moment. Sarah's bouquet trembled slightly in her hands, not from nervousness, but from excitement and anticipation. Father Rodriguez looked down at his ceremonial book, then up at the young couple before him. He had officiated their pre-marriage counseling with particular care, having watched Sarah grow up in his parish and having come to know and respect David during their sessions together. He felt confident that these two young people were well prepared for marriage, with realistic expectations and a strong foundation of faith, communication, and mutual support. But as he opened his mouth to speak the traditional words, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," something unusual caught his attention. From his position at the altar, facing the congregation, Father Rodriguez had a clear view of the entire church. What he saw in that moment made him pause, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed something that seemed out of place. At the back of the church, near the main doors, he noticed a man who didn't quite fit with the rest of the wedding guests. While everyone else was dressed in their wedding best and focused intently on the ceremony, this individual seemed agitated, checking his watch repeatedly and scanning the crowd in a way that suggested he wasn't there to celebrate Sarah and David's union. The man was dressed appropriately enough, dark suit, conservative tie, but something about his body language and the way he kept looking toward the exits rather than the altar triggered an instinct that Father Rodriguez had developed during his many years of pastoral care. Father Rodriguez had developed a keen sense for reading people during his 20 years of ministry. He had counseled families through crises, officiated at funerals where tensions ran high, and had unfortunately witnessed his share of disruptions during important ceremonies. The training he had received for handling various emergency situations had taught him to trust his instincts. And right now, those instincts were telling him that something was not right. The man at the back of the church was now joined by another individual, and they appeared to be communicating through subtle gestures. What concerned Father Rodriguez most was that neither man seemed to be paying any attention to the ceremony itself. Instead, they were systematically scanning the congregation, their eyes moving methodically from row to row as if they were looking for someone specific. Without breaking his composure or alerting the congregation to his concerns, Father Rodriguez made a decision that would change the course of this wedding day forever. Instead of continuing with the ceremony, he looked directly at Sarah and David and said in a clear, authoritative voice, "Code Black." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Sarah and David, who had been lost in the romantic moment of their wedding ceremony, suddenly snapped to attention with expressions of confusion and growing alarm. The guests, who had been anticipating the joyful conclusion of the ceremony, began to murmur among themselves, unsure of what they had just heard or what it might mean. But David, with his paramedic training and experience with emergency protocols, understood immediately. Code Black was a term used in hospitals and emergency services to indicate a bomb threat or the presence of an explosive device. His face went pale as the implications hit him, and he instinctively moved closer to Sarah, his protective instincts kicking in even as his mind raced to process what was happening. "Everyone please remain calm," Father Rodriguez continued, his voice steady but with an underlying urgency that commanded attention. "I need everyone to quietly and orderly move toward the side exits of the church. Do not use the main doors at the back. Please move slowly and stay together." The congregation, initially confused, began to understand that this was not part of the normal wedding ceremony. Parents instinctively reached for their children, elderly guests began to worry about their ability to move quickly if necessary, and the members of David's paramedic crew immediately shifted into emergency response mode, standing and beginning to help guide people toward the exits Father Rodriguez had indicated. Sarah stood frozen at the altar, her mind struggling to process what was happening. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, the culmination of months of planning and years of dreaming. She looked around at her wedding decorations, at her family and friends who had traveled from far away to celebrate with her, at her dress that had taken months to alter perfectly, and felt a surreal disconnect between the fairy tale moment she had been living and the nightmare that seemed to be unfolding. David took her hand firmly. "Sarah, we need to move now," he said quietly but urgently. His training had taught him that in emergency situations, every second mattered and hesitation could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. "Trust me, we need to do what Father Rodriguez says." Meanwhile, Father Rodriguez had moved to a position where he could better observe the two suspicious men at the back of the church. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. One of the men was now speaking into what appeared to be a small communication device, while the other had moved to block the main exit. Their coordinated movements and professional demeanor suggested that this was not a random threat, but a planned operation. The church, which moments earlier had been filled with joy and celebration, was now filled with the controlled chaos of an emergency evacuation. The wedding guests, many of whom had never experienced anything like this before, were doing their best to follow instructions while grappling with their own fear and confusion. Some people were crying, others were trying to use their cell phones to call for help, and everyone was looking around desperately for answers that no one seemed to have. Sarah's mother, Maria, was near the front of the church with the other parents and had heard Father Rodriguez's words clearly. Her first instinct was to reach her daughter, but she was separated from the altar area by several rows of guests who were now moving toward the exits. She called out, "Sarah!" but her voice was lost in the growing commotion. David's best man, Marcus, drawing on his experience as a paramedic and first responder, immediately began to help coordinate the evacuation. He moved to assist elderly guests who were having difficulty standing or walking quickly, while keeping one eye on David and Sarah to make sure they were moving toward safety. His training had taught him that panic was often more dangerous than the actual threat, and he used his calm, authoritative voice to help keep people focused and moving in an orderly fashion. As the evacuation continued, Father Rodriguez made another crucial decision. He activated the church's emergency communication system, a protocol that had been established in coordination with local law enforcement several years earlier following nationwide concerns about security at religious institutions. With the press of a concealed button near the altar, he sent a silent alarm directly to the police department and emergency services, indicating that St. Michael's Church was experiencing a code black situation. The response was swift and professional. Within minutes, the first police units were arriving at the scene, followed quickly by the bomb squad, emergency medical services, and FBI agents who had been monitoring potential threats in the area. The law enforcement response revealed something that the wedding guests couldn't have known. There had been intelligence suggesting that a high-profile target might be present at a public gathering in their area that day, and St. Michael's Church had been identified as a potential location of interest. What no one in the wedding party knew was that one of the invited guests, David's supervisor from the paramedic service, Captain James Morrison, was not just a paramedic supervisor. He was also a key witness in a federal case involving a major drug trafficking operation that had been using ambulance services to transport illegal substances. The criminals involved in this operation had been looking for an opportunity to eliminate Captain Morrison before he could testify, and they had discovered that he would be attending David's wedding. The two suspicious men at the back of the church were not wedding crashers or random criminals. They were professional operatives who had been hired to carry out a targeted assassination. Their plan had been to wait until the ceremony was concluded and guests were leaving, then to eliminate their target in the confusion of people exiting the church. They had not expected the sharp-eyed priest to notice their presence and take immediate action. As the church continued to empty through the side exits, law enforcement was establishing a perimeter around the building. Bomb-sniffing dogs were brought in to sweep the area for explosive devices, while sharpshooters took positions to provide protection for the evacuating civilians. The FBI agents coordinated with local police to ensure that the entire area was secured and that no additional threats were present. Sarah and David, along with their immediate families, were among the first to be escorted to safety by the arriving officers. They were taken to a secure location several blocks away from the church, where FBI agents began to explain the situation to them. The revelation that their wedding had been targeted, not because of anything they had done, but because of Captain Morrison's role as a witness in a federal case, was almost impossible to process. "This is insane," Sarah said, still wearing her wedding dress but now wrapped in a blanket that a paramedic had provided. "This was supposed to be our wedding day. How did this become about drug traffickers and federal cases?" She looked at David, searching his face for answers that he didn't have. David was equally stunned, but his emergency training helped him stay focused on the immediate situation. "Captain Morrison," he said to the FBI agents, "is he safe? Are all our guests accounted for?" His concern for others, even in the midst of his own crisis, demonstrated the character that had made Sarah fall in love with him in the first place. The FBI agent in charge, Special Agent Catherine Williams, provided regular updates as the situation developed. "We have successfully evacuated all 143 guests from the church. Captain Morrison is in protective custody, and we have the two suspects in custody as well. Our bomb squad has completed their sweep of the church building and found no explosive devices. However, we did find weapons and detailed surveillance materials in the suspect's vehicle. The realization of how close they had all come to a potential tragedy was overwhelming. If Father Rodriguez had not been so observant, if he had not acted quickly and decisively, the outcome could have been catastrophic. The wedding guests who had come to celebrate love and new beginnings had unknowingly walked into what could have been a deadly situation. As the hours passed and the initial shock began to wear off, the practical implications of what had happened started to sink in. The church was now a crime scene and would remain closed for investigation. The reception venue had been notified and was holding the catered dinner until they received word about whether the celebration could continue. The wedding photographers and videographers had captured the most unusual wedding footage any of them had ever recorded. Sarah's mother arrived at the secure location where the wedding party was being held, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her daughter. "I was so scared," Maria whispered. "When I heard Father Rodriguez say those words, I didn't understand at first, but then I saw people's faces changing and I knew something terrible was happening." The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what had been planned. The two arrested suspects, identified as Marcus Volkov and James Patterson, no relation to the church organist, were part of a sophisticated criminal organization that specialized in eliminating witnesses in federal cases. They had been conducting surveillance on Captain Morrison for several weeks, learning his routines and looking for the perfect opportunity to carry out their mission. The wedding had presented what they believed would be an ideal scenario, a crowded public event where their target would be relaxed and off guard, surrounded by civilians, making it difficult for law enforcement to respond quickly and effectively. Their plan had been to wait until guests were leaving the church after the ceremony, then to create a distraction, potentially involving actual explosives, while they eliminated Captain Morrison in the resulting chaos. What they had not anticipated was Father Rodriguez's years of experience reading people and situations, combined with his training in emergency protocols. The priest's quick thinking and decisive action had not only saved lives, but had also prevented these dangerous criminals from escaping to potentially threaten others in the future. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the FBI investigation continued, more details emerged about the broader criminal network that had been targeting Captain Morrison. The drug trafficking operation he was set to testify against was far larger and more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized, involving multiple cities, corrupted emergency services personnel, and millions of dollars in illegal substances. Captain Morrison's testimony was considered crucial to dismantling the entire operation. The realization that their wedding had been targeted as part of such a significant criminal enterprise was almost surreal for Sarah and David. They had been planning what they hoped would be a perfect day to celebrate their love and commitment, never imagining that they would become part of a federal law enforcement operation. The hardest part, Sarah later reflected, was not just that our wedding was disrupted, but that we realized how many people we care about had been put in danger without knowing it. My grandmother, David's little nephews, all our friends. They came to celebrate with us and ended up in a potentially life-threatening situation. The media attention that followed was intense and overwhelming. Local news stations covered the story extensively, with headlines like, "Wedding Ceremony Becomes FBI Sting Operation," and "Priest's Quick Thinking Prevents Church Tragedy." National news outlets picked up the story, fascinated by the dramatic turn of events and the heroic actions of Father Rodriguez. But for Sarah and David, the media attention was just another challenge to navigate during what should have been the happiest time of their lives. They found themselves giving interviews and answering questions about their code black wedding when they should have been enjoying their honeymoon and settling into married life. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy. Both Sarah and David were called as witnesses in the federal case against the broader criminal organization, not because they had any direct involvement, but because the attempt to disrupt their wedding was part of the evidence against the defendants. Captain Morrison's testimony, which the criminals had been so desperate to prevent, ultimately proved instrumental in securing convictions against multiple members of the trafficking ring.
Father Rodriguez became something of a local hero, though he consistently deflected praise and insisted that he had simply done what any responsible person would do when faced with a potential threat to his congregation. The Catholic diocese recognized his actions with a special commendation, and he received letters of thanks from law enforcement agencies and community members. The question that everyone kept asking Sarah and David was whether they would reschedule their wedding ceremony. For weeks after the incident, they weren't sure how to answer. The trauma of what had happened, combined with the ongoing legal proceedings and media attention, made it difficult to think about celebrating when they were still processing what had occurred. For a while, David admitted, neither of us wanted to have anything that reminded us of that day. The idea of walking down an aisle again, of having Father Rodriguez stand at an altar and try to perform a ceremony, it brought back all the fear and confusion we had felt when everything went wrong. But as time passed and the immediate crisis began to fade, they realized that they didn't want the criminals who had targeted their wedding to have the final word on their marriage. They had been legally married during a small civil ceremony shortly after the incident, but they still wanted the church wedding and celebration they had originally planned. The decision to reschedule was not easy, but it represented their determination to reclaim their narrative and not allow fear to dictate their choices.
6 months after the Code Black incident, Sarah and David made the decision to hold their real wedding ceremony. The legal proceedings were still ongoing, but the immediate threat had been eliminated with the arrest and conviction of the two operatives, who had targeted Captain Morrison. The broader criminal network was being systematically dismantled by federal authorities, and Captain Morrison's testimony had already helped secure several major convictions. The decision to reschedule wasn't made lightly. Both Sarah and David had experienced what psychologists call post-traumatic stress following the incident. Sarah found herself having panic attacks in crowded places, while David struggled with hypervigilance during his paramedic shifts, constantly scanning for potential threats even during routine medical calls. They had both been attending counseling, both individually and as a couple, to work through the psychological impact of having their most important day turned into a crisis situation. The therapist helped us understand that avoiding the church wedding would actually give more power to the people who had tried to hurt us, Sarah explained. We realized that we needed to complete what we had started, not just for ourselves, but to prove that love and community are stronger than fear and violence. Father Rodriguez was deeply moved when Sarah and David approached him about rescheduling the ceremony. In the months following the incident, he had been dealing with his own emotional aftermath, questioning whether he had made the right decision and wondering if there had been other ways to handle the situation that might have been less traumatic for everyone involved. When Sarah and David told me they wanted to try again, Father Rodriguez later recalled, I felt a profound sense of healing. It wasn't just about giving them the wedding they deserved. It was about all of us reclaiming that sacred space and showing that faith and love cannot be intimidated by those who would do harm. The rescheduled wedding was planned with both celebration and security in mind. Local law enforcement, grateful for Father Rodriguez's role in preventing what could have been a major tragedy, offered to provide discreet security for the event. The FBI, still monitoring potential threats related to the ongoing case, conducted a thorough security assessment of the church and surrounding area. But Sarah and David were determined that their second wedding attempt would focus on joy rather than fear. They invited the same guests who had been present during the Code Black incident, understanding that many of them were also dealing with their own emotional responses to what had happened. The wedding became not just a celebration of Sarah and David's love, but a communal act of healing and resilience. The preparations for the second ceremony were both easier and more difficult than the first time around. Easier because many of the vendors and arrangements were already in place, but more difficult because everyone involved was hyper-aware of security concerns and the possibility that something could go wrong again. Sarah's wedding dress, which had been preserved carefully after the interrupted ceremony, was cleaned and prepared again. Looking at herself in the mirror wearing the same dress that had been part of such a traumatic experience was emotionally challenging, but Sarah was determined to create new, positive memories associated with the garment that had been her grandmother's. The guest list for the rescheduled wedding included some new additions. Several of the law enforcement officers who had responded to the Code Black situation, FBI agent Catherine Williams, who had coordinated the response, and even some of the paramedics who had provided medical support during the evacuation. These additions transformed the wedding from a purely personal celebration into a communal act of healing and resilience.
Captain Morrison, whose presence at the first wedding had inadvertently made it a target, was facing a difficult decision about whether to attend the rescheduled ceremony. He felt tremendous guilt about the trauma that Sarah and David had experienced, even though everyone assured him that he bore no responsibility for the criminal's actions. "I kept thinking that if I had been there, none of this would have happened to them," Captain Morrison explained. But Sarah and David insisted that I had to be there for the real wedding. They said that hiding from these people, letting them change our lives and our relationships, would be letting them win. The rescheduled wedding date was set for a Saturday in late spring, almost exactly 1 year after the original date. The timing was symbolic. It represented a full cycle of healing and growth, and it allowed everyone involved to demonstrate that they had not been permanently damaged by the experience. In the weeks leading up to the rescheduled ceremony, Sarah and David found themselves becoming advocates for other couples who had experienced wedding-related traumas. They were contacted by several couples who had faced different types of disruptions, from severe weather to family emergencies to vendor problems. And they found that sharing their story helped others put their own challenges in perspective. We realized that our experience, as extreme as it was, had taught us something important about what really matters in a marriage. All the details we had stressed about for the first wedding, the flowers, the music, the perfect timing, none of that mattered when we were faced with a real crisis. What mattered was that we were together, that we protected each other, and that we had the support of our community.
The morning of the rescheduled wedding dawned bright and clear, with none of the nervous energy that had characterized the original wedding day. Instead, there was a sense of calm determination among everyone involved. Sarah woke up feeling peaceful rather than excited, David felt focused rather than nervous, and their families approached the day with a mature appreciation for what they were about to witness. The security preparations were thorough but discreet. Plainclothes officers were positioned around the church and surrounding area, but their presence was designed to be reassuring rather than alarming. The church had implemented new security protocols in the months following the Code Black incident, including better monitoring of who entered the building and improved communication systems with local law enforcement. Father Rodriguez had spent considerable time preparing for this ceremony, not just in terms of the liturgy and logistics, but emotionally and spiritually. He had worked with a counselor specializing in trauma experienced by clergy, helping him process his own feelings about the interrupted wedding and his decision to call Code Black. He felt ready to provide the sacred ceremony that Sarah and David deserved. As guests began arriving for the rescheduled ceremony, the atmosphere was notably different from a typical wedding. There was a deeper sense of appreciation for being there, a recognition that they were participating in something that transcended a normal celebration. Many of the original guests had stayed in touch with each other in the months following the Code Black incident, forming bonds based on their shared experience that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Sarah's preparation for the second ceremony was a study in contrasts compared to the first attempt. Where she had been nervous and excited the first time, she was now calm and focused. She understood that the dress, the flowers, and the perfect hair and makeup were lovely additions to the day, but not the essence of what was happening. "The first time, I was so worried about everything being perfect," Sarah said as her bridesmaids helped her into her grandmother's dress for the second time. "Now I realize that the most important thing is that David and I are choosing each other in front of the people we love, with God's blessing. Everything else is just decoration." The bridesmaids, who had also been through counseling to deal with the trauma of the interrupted ceremony, were approaching this second attempt with a mixture of excitement and protective concern for Sarah. They had formed an even closer bond through their shared experience, and they were determined to help create the joyful memory that had been stolen from them the first time. David's preparation was equally different the second time around. His groomsmen, including Marcus, who had helped coordinate the evacuation during the Code Black incident, were more relaxed but also more aware of their surroundings. The paramedic crew that was attending had developed a kind of informal security awareness that came from their emergency response training, but they were careful not to let their vigilance overshadow the celebration. As 3 o'clock approached, the same time that had been scheduled for the original ceremony, everyone involved felt the weight of the moment. They were not just beginning a wedding ceremony, they were completing something that had been interrupted, reclaiming a space that had been violated, and demonstrating that love and community could overcome fear and violence. The processional began exactly as it had been planned a year earlier. The bridesmaids walked down the aisle with the same dignity and joy, but with an added layer of meaning that came from knowing how precious and fragile these moments could be. When Sarah appeared at the back of the church on her father's arm, the emotional impact was even greater than it would have been originally. This time, when Father Rodriguez took his position at the altar and looked out at the congregation, he saw faces that reflected not just joy and anticipation, but gratitude and relief. These were people who understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just a wedding, but a triumph of hope over fear, love over hatred, and community over those who would try to destroy it.
Dearly beloved, Father Rodriguez began, using the same words he had started with during the interrupted ceremony. We are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join Sarah Elena Martinez and David Michael Thompson in holy matrimony. But this time, the familiar words carried additional weight and meaning that touched everyone present. The ceremony proceeded without interruption, but it was far from ordinary. Each traditional element, the readings, the exchange of vows, the blessing of the rings, was infused with a deeper appreciation for the sacred nature of what was taking place. The congregation participated with an engagement and emotional investment that went beyond what is typical at weddings. When Sarah and David exchanged their personal vows, which they had rewritten to reflect what they had learned from their experience, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. Sarah spoke about how the crisis had shown her that David's protective instincts and calm leadership were even stronger than she had realized, and how his first concern, even in the midst of chaos, had been for her safety and the safety of others. David's vows addressed how Sarah's resilience and determination to not let fear control their lives had inspired him to be braver and more committed to their relationship. He spoke about how watching her decide to reschedule the wedding, despite the trauma they had experienced, had shown him that she was not just the woman he wanted to marry, but the partner he wanted beside him through any challenge life might present. The exchange of rings was particularly emotional. The same rings that had been blessed during the interrupted ceremony were blessed again, but this time they carried the additional symbolism of persistence and commitment in the face of adversity. When David placed the ring on Sarah's finger, his voice was steady but filled with emotion as he repeated the traditional words, "With this ring, I thee wed." Father Rodriguez, who had spent months preparing spiritually and emotionally for this moment, delivered a homily that addressed not just the couple's commitment to each other, but the community's role in supporting and protecting marriage and family. He spoke about how the events of the previous year had shown everyone present the importance of vigilance, community support, and the courage to act when others are threatened. Sarah and David's love story has been tested in ways that most couples never face. They have learned that marriage is not just a private commitment between two people, but a public commitment that involves the entire community. We have all learned that protecting and celebrating love requires courage, awareness, and the willingness to act when threats arise. The moment that everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. Father Rodriguez looked down at his ceremonial book, then up at Sarah and David, and said the words that had been interrupted a year earlier. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. David, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was met with enthusiastic applause and cheering that seemed to release a year's worth of pent-up emotion and celebration. Guests were crying and laughing simultaneously, cameras were flashing, and the joy in the church was palpable. Sarah and David had finally achieved their dream of being married in the church where Sarah had grown up, surrounded by everyone they loved with the blessing of their faith community. But the ceremony wasn't quite over. Father Rodriguez had one more surprise.
As Sarah and David turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, he announced that the church had commissioned a special plaque to commemorate not just their wedding, but the events that had led up to it. The plaque, which would be installed near the altar, read, "In memory of the courage and quick thinking that protected this congregation on date, and in celebration of the love that refused to be intimidated, may this place always be a sanctuary of faith, hope, and love." The recessional was triumphant in a way that went far beyond a normal wedding celebration. As Sarah and David walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, they were not just beginning their married life together, but completing a journey that had tested their relationship and their community in ways no one could have anticipated. The reception that followed was equally meaningful and joyful. The toasts included not just the traditional celebrations of the bride and groom, but acknowledgments of Father Rodriguez's quick thinking, Captain Morrison's grace under pressure, and the entire community's resilience in the face of adversity. Agent Catherine Williams, who had coordinated the law enforcement response to the Code Black incident, was invited to speak at the reception. Her toast highlighted how Sarah and David's decision to reschedule their wedding had served as an inspiration to law enforcement officers who deal with trauma and violence regularly. In our line of work, Agent Williams said, "We see the worst of human nature on a regular basis." But Sarah and David's story reminds us why we do this work, to protect moments like this, to ensure that love and celebration and community can flourish without fear.
The success of the rescheduled wedding ceremony marked the beginning of a new chapter not just for Sarah and David, but for the entire St. Michael's Church community. In the months that followed, the church saw an increase in attendance and community engagement as people who had been present during the Code Black incident developed a deeper appreciation for the sanctuary and safety that their faith community provided. Father Rodriguez found that his experience during the crisis had enhanced his ability to counsel parishioners facing their own challenges and traumas. His quick thinking and decisive action had earned him respect not just within his own congregation, but throughout the broader community, and he began receiving invitations to speak about crisis management and community safety at other churches and community organizations. For Sarah and David, married life brought its own adjustments and joys, but they found that their shared experience of the interrupted wedding had actually strengthened their relationship in unexpected ways. They had seen each other respond to crisis, had navigated trauma together, and had made the difficult decision to move forward with their plans despite the fear and uncertainty they felt. Most couples don't get tested the way we were before they're even married, David reflected during an interview 6 months after the successful ceremony. But in some ways, I think it prepared us for marriage better than traditional pre-marriage counseling could have. We learned that we could count on each other when things got scary and uncertain. The legal aftermath of the Code Black incident continued for more than 2 years after the original wedding date. Both Sarah and David were called to testify in multiple trials related to the broader criminal organization that had targeted Captain Morrison. Their testimony helped prosecutors establish the far-reaching impact of the criminal network and the lengths to which the organization was willing to go to silence witnesses. Captain Morrison, whose presence at the wedding had inadvertently created the dangerous situation, became a close family friend of Sarah and David. His gratitude for their understanding and forgiveness, combined with his admiration for their resilience, led to a lasting friendship that enriched all of their lives. "They could have blamed me for what happened," Captain Morrison said. "Instead, they welcomed me into their family and showed me what real grace and forgiveness look like. Attending their successful wedding ceremony was one of the most emotional experiences of my life." The story of the Code Black wedding gained national attention and was eventually featured in several books about emergency response and community resilience. Sarah and David were invited to speak at conferences for emergency responders, religious leaders, and community organizations about crisis management and recovery from trauma. But perhaps most importantly, their story became an inspiration for other couples facing wedding-related challenges. They received letters from couples who had experienced everything from severe weather to family emergencies to venue cancellations, all of whom found encouragement in Sarah and David's example of persistence and resilience. We learned that the wedding is just one day, But the marriage is a lifetime, Sarah explained during one of their speaking engagements. If you're so focused on having the perfect wedding day that you can't handle unexpected challenges, you're not prepared for the reality of marriage, which is full of unexpected challenges. The anniversary of the original wedding date became an important day of reflection for the couple. Rather than ignoring the date or treating it as a day of trauma, they chose to observe it as a reminder of their growth and resilience. Each year, they visit St. Michael's Church to pray and reflect on the lessons they learned from their experience. Father Rodriguez, now approaching retirement after more than 25 years of service to St. Michael's, considers the Code Black incident and its aftermath to be one of the defining experiences of his ministry. The plaque commemorating the events remains near the altar, serving as a reminder to all who worship there of the importance of vigilance, community, and courage. That day taught all of us that evil exists in the world and can intrude even into our most sacred and joyful moments. But it also taught us that good people, working together with courage and quick thinking, can overcome evil. Sarah and David's love story is ultimately a story about the triumph of good over evil, love over hatred, and hope over fear. The criminal organization that had targeted the wedding was ultimately dismantled completely, with dozens of arrests and convictions resulting from the investigation that began with the Code Black incident. Law enforcement officials credited the quick response at St. Michael's Church with providing crucial evidence and preventing additional crimes that had been planned by the organization. 5 years after their Code Black wedding, Sarah and David have built a strong marriage and started a family. Their first child, a daughter they named Grace, was baptized at St. Michael's Church by Father Rodriguez in a ceremony that was joyful, peaceful, and blissfully uneventful.
As their story spread through various media outlets and speaking engagements, Sarah and David discovered that their experience had resonated with people far beyond their immediate community. They received messages from around the world, from couples planning their own weddings, from emergency responders who had faced similar situations, from religious leaders seeking guidance on crisis management, and from ordinary people who found inspiration in their story of resilience and determination. One of the most meaningful responses came from a couple in Australia whose wedding had been interrupted by a bushfire emergency. The bride wrote to Sarah, explaining how reading about the Code Black wedding had helped her and her husband work through their own trauma and ultimately decide to have a second ceremony to create the positive memories they had been denied. "Your story showed us that we weren't being silly or dramatic by wanting to try again," the Australian bride wrote. "It helped us understand that reclaiming our wedding day was about more than just having a party. It was about not letting external circumstances define one of the most important moments of our lives." These connections led Sarah and David to establish a small nonprofit organization dedicated to helping couples who had experienced wedding day traumas. Their organization, called Second Chances, provided counseling resources, practical support for rescheduling ceremonies, and a network of vendors willing to donate services to couples who had lost money due to emergency situations. The work with Second Chances also brought them into contact with other types of trauma survivors, expanding their understanding of resilience and recovery. They worked with couples whose weddings had been affected by natural disasters, terrorist attacks, family emergencies, and even vendor fraud. Each story reinforced their belief that love and commitment could overcome even the most challenging circumstances. Father Rodriguez became an advisor to Second Chances, sharing his expertise in crisis management and pastoral care. His experience with the Code Black incident had led him to develop training materials for other clergy members on recognizing and responding to potential threats during religious ceremonies. The reality is that churches, synagogues, mosques, and other places of worship have become targets in ways they never were before, Father Rodriguez explained during one training session. "We have a responsibility to our congregations to be prepared while still maintaining the open, welcoming atmosphere that makes these places sacred." The security enhancements implemented at St. Michael's Church following the Code Black incident became a model for other religious institutions. The discreet but effective measures, including improved communication systems, trained volunteer security teams, and coordination with local law enforcement, demonstrated that safety and sanctuary could coexist.
Sarah's career as an elementary school teacher also evolved as a result of her experience. She began incorporating lessons about emergency preparedness and community resilience into her curriculum, teaching children age-appropriate ways to stay safe, while also emphasizing the importance of helping others during difficult times. Children are naturally resilient, but they need to understand that bad things can happen and that there are good people working to keep them safe, Sarah explained to other educators during a workshop on trauma-informed teaching. The goal is to build awareness and confidence, not fear. David's work as a paramedic took on new dimensions as well. His experience during the Code Black incident had demonstrated the importance of remaining calm and focused during chaotic situations, skills that proved invaluable in his emergency medical work. He became a trainer for other paramedics, teaching crisis management and decision-making under pressure. The couple's relationship with the law enforcement officers who had responded to their emergency deepened over time. Agent Catherine Williams became a regular attendee at their anniversary celebrations, and several of the local police officers who had secured the scene remained close friends. These relationships provided ongoing insight into the broader implications of the criminal network that they had unknowingly encountered. Sarah and David's case wasn't just about stopping one assassination attempt, Agent Williams explained during a law enforcement conference several years later. The intelligence we gathered during that investigation helped us dismantle an entire network of criminal organizations operating across multiple states. Their wedding day literally saved dozens of lives by giving us the break we needed to catch these people. The ongoing legal proceedings provided regular reminders of how serious the threat had been. As more details emerged during various trials, Sarah and David learned that the criminal organization had been planning multiple attacks, and that the disruption of their wedding had prevented a series of violent crimes that had been scheduled for the following weeks. It's overwhelming to think about sometimes, David admitted during a therapy session several years after the incident. We went to church to get married and ended up stopping a major criminal operation. It makes you wonder about fate and purpose and whether there are larger forces at work in our lives. The psychological impact of their experience continued to evolve over time. While the initial trauma symptoms had largely resolved through counseling and the successful rescheduling of their wedding, both Sarah and David found that they had developed a heightened awareness of their surroundings and a deeper appreciation for ordinary, peaceful moments. I used to take for granted things like going to the grocery store or sitting in a restaurant without scanning for exits or potential threats, Sarah reflected. Now I notice those things, but I've learned to see that awareness as a gift rather than a burden. It makes me more grateful for safety and normalcy.
10 years after the Code Black wedding, Sarah and David have built a life that reflects both the trauma they experienced and the growth that emerged from it. They have 3 children now, Grace, Hope, and Samuel, whose names reflect their parents' journey through crisis toward renewal and family. Their marriage, tested by extraordinary circumstances before it even officially began, has proven to be remarkably strong and resilient. The anniversary of their original wedding date has become a family tradition that combines remembrance with celebration. Each year, they visit St. Michael's Church as a family, spending time in prayer and reflection before gathering with friends and family for a celebration that honors both the challenges they've overcome and the blessings they've received. Father Rodriguez, now retired but still living in the parish, remains a central figure in their lives. He baptized all 3 of their children and continues to provide spiritual guidance as they navigate the ongoing implications of their unusual love story. The plaque commemorating the Code Black incident remains near the altar at St. Michael's, now accompanied by additional plaques recognizing the church's commitment to community safety and resilience. That day changed all of our lives in ways we couldn't have imagined, Father Rodriguez said during a recent anniversary gathering, but it also revealed the strength and love that were already present in this community. Sarah and David's story is really our story, a story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. The Second Chances organization has grown beyond their original vision, now serving couples across the country who have experienced various types of wedding day traumas. They have helped coordinate replacement ceremonies for couples affected by hurricanes, wildfires, terrorist attacks, and even the COVID-19 pandemic. Their work has been featured in national magazines and television programs, always with the message that love and commitment can overcome any obstacle.
The criminal network that targeted their wedding is now completely dismantled, with the last of the associated trials concluding just 2 years ago. Captain Morrison, whose testimony proved crucial to the prosecution's success, has since retired from emergency services but remains close to Sarah and David's family. He is Uncle Jim to their children, a beloved figure who represents the positive relationships that emerged from the crisis. Looking back, I think the most important thing we learned is that you can't let fear control your choices. Yes, bad things can happen, even during the most joyful moments of your life. But if you let the possibility of bad things stop you from pursuing joy and love and community, then the bad guys win without even having to do anything. Sarah's work with trauma-affected couples has led her to pursue additional training in counseling and crisis intervention. She recently completed a graduate degree in counseling psychology with a specialization in helping individuals and couples recover from unexpected trauma. Her dissertation research focused on post-traumatic growth in couples who had experienced crisis during significant life events. What we've learned through our work with Second Chances is that trauma doesn't have to be the end of the story. For many couples, working through trauma together actually strengthens their relationship and gives them tools for handling future challenges. The key is having support, refusing to let fear make your decisions, and focusing on what you can control rather than what you can't. The children have grown up knowing the story of their parents' unusual wedding, but in an age-appropriate way that emphasizes the positive outcomes rather than the frightening details. Grace, now 8 years old, often tells people that her daddy and mommy are heroes who caught bad guys at their wedding, a simplification that captures the essential truth of what happened. The story continues to inspire others, with Sarah and David receiving regular invitations to speak at conferences, churches, and community events. Their message has remained consistent over the years, that love, community, and courage can overcome even the most challenging circumstances, and that choosing hope over fear is always the right decision. "We never planned to become public speakers or advocates," David said during a recent presentation to a group of emergency responders. "We just wanted to get married and build a life together. But sometimes life gives you experiences that you're meant to share with others. If our story helps even one person choose courage over fear, or helps one couple work through their own challenges, then everything we went through was worth it." As they look toward the future, Sarah and David remain committed to their community, their family, and their mission of helping others overcome crisis and trauma. Their love story, which began with dreams of a perfect wedding and was tested by unimaginable circumstances, has become a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of community, and the triumph of love over fear. The Code Black wedding is now part of local legend, a story told and retold as an example of how ordinary people can respond extraordinarily when faced with crisis. But for Sarah and David, it's simply the unusual beginning of an ordinary, blessed life filled with love, family, and service to others. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.